Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. This 30-minute podcast features a new author interviewed by me every single day, 365 days a year, for about 30 minutes. I am also the publisher for Zibby Books, which publishes 12 books a year in fiction and memoir. Our books are already out now. You can check it out on zibbybooks.com. And we have a magazine called Zibby Mag, where we have lots of wonderful essays and lifestyle features. That's at zibbymag.com. We have classes at zibbyclasses.com. And I recently opened a bookstore in LA called Zibby's Bookshop at 1113 Montana Avenue at 11th Street in Santa Monica. I hope that you are able to enjoy some of our other offerings. But this here podcast is the basis of all of it and started in 2018. And no matter what I do, this is basically my favorite thing. Enjoy. Douglas Brunt is the author of The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel, Genius, Power, and Deception on the Eve of World War I. He is also the New York Times bestselling author of Ghosts of Manhattan, The Means, Trophy Son, and now The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel. He is the host of the top-rated Sirius XM author podcast, Dedicated with Doug Brunt. A Philadelphia native, he lives in Connecticut with his wife and 3 children. And by the way, Doug and I worked together at Idealab in New York after I transferred from the Pasadena office back in, maybe 1999, 2000. And he was one of the first people I met at that job. And now here it is, 22 years later, 23 years later. Very funny. Welcome, Doug. Thanks so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel, Genius, Power, and Deception on the Eve of World War I.
Zibby, it's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, please. Thank you. It's so funny after all these years at Idealab back in the day, rolling around in our errand chairs or whatever. But anyway, here we are.
I know, with those wooden boards as our desks and that totally open concept. We were early with the open concept office design, I think.
Yes, very early. No privacy at all. Lots of phone conversations. Pre-Zoom era. Anyway. Okay. You wrote about, in the beginning of this book, how you stumbled upon this topic when you were dealing with your own boat and all of that. Tell listeners about where you got the inspiration for the book, and then all the research you must have done that went into it, and why you feel like Rudolf Diesel is one to be remembered. And I just found this to be utterly fascinating.
Oh, thanks. You're right. I did stumble into it in the luckiest of ways. And it's just this incredible piece of history that's been paved over for reasons that I discuss in the book. You'll understand why it's been paved over. I'm a novelist traditionally, as I've written a few novels. And years ago, I bought this old boat. And I was talking to the guy at the boatyard, what should I do? Because it was, needed some work. And it had these old gasoline engines in it. And he said, well, the first thing you ought to do is to repower this to diesel. And like most of your listeners, 7 years ago, I didn't know anything about diesel. I thought, it's an engine. What's the difference between diesel and anything else? And he went on this whole rant of why marine diesel in particular is the way to go. 0% of boat fires happen with diesel. All fires are from gasoline engines. The gasoline is fumy and very flammable, and gasoline engines start with a spark. Diesel does not. And fuel efficiency is 3 or 4 times better with diesel. So I did repower with diesel. And then I was working on ideas for the next novel, and I was clicking around the internet and came across this list of mysterious disappearances at sea. And on the list was Rudolf Diesel, who had disappeared in 1913 on the eve of World War I. So I was like, wow, I wonder if Rudolf Diesel has any connection to these diesel engines that I just bought. And of course, I clicked through it, and it does. He is the inventor of the diesel engine and was this enormous global celebrity at the time in 1913. And again, he's been kind of scrubbed from history. But when he disappeared in 1913, it was massive news around the world. The New York Times to all the papers in Europe and Russia and Asia were covering this crazy disappearance. And so then I went down a rabbit hole for 5 years and came back out with his book.
5 years. Where did you even start? Like, which archives? I know you referenced a lot of books and things that had been written, but of course you put together your own theory, which at the end is like, oh my gosh, oh wow, like that. Of course, like this makes total sense. Where did you start, and what were some points in the research process where you had some light bulb moments and you were like so excited about it?
Well, as a novelist, I initially was thinking I'd come at this from the angle of historical fiction. And well, there's so little written about the guy, particularly in English language. There was not much to find. And I thought, well, I'll just fill in all the gaps. I have this sort of idea. It's almost like, those paintings that are all dots and you look at it, but if you look at it for long enough, you see a unicorn or something like that. It was like that. I just had read enough about this case. I became obsessed with it. And the more I read about it, the more I had a theory, because the theories that have been accepted, even in Encyclopedia Britannica, that many people presume it was a suicide, that he jumped off this ship. So the quick story is that Rudolf Diesel on September 29 was traveling from Belgium to England on an overnight passenger ferry. And in the night, he disappears. They hold the ship at sea and they search it. They can't find him. All they find is his hat and his coat along the promenade deck at the stern of the ship. And so they presume that it was suicide, that he jumped over. And two other theories were that he was killed by either Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany, or John Rockefeller and agents of big oil. And there are all these in-depth possible motives of why they might have done it. So I was exploring these theories, became obsessed with the case. And the more I unearthed, the more I realized this story actually needs to be told as nonfiction. It's not been done and I can do it. And so I initially found a lot of stuff. It's amazing. Research works so much differently now than it did a few decades ago. I think you and I are roughly the same age. And so we would scroll through microfiche, plastic film in libraries. And a lot of things have been scanned. Old newspapers have been scanned, and you can do a lot with keyword search. You still have to sort of narrow in on that. But I was down in the New York Public Library in Midtown going through old newspaper articles, because that 2-week period after his disappearance, it was a flood of newspaper coverage. And then because World War I followed so closely on the heels of it, and because there were manipulations in the media, it has never really no one's ever sort of gone back to try to reconcile all the conflicting reports in the media. So that was just a great starting place, because I found all kinds of facts that a person couldn't really go through these newspaper archives in an efficient way, even a few decades ago. So much has been uploaded. So I was able to do that level of research, which reinforced the theory. And then I got into archives and throughout Europe and America. And I actually reached out to my old high school, a buddy there who put me in touch with the German professor, who then translated reams of diaries and letters of Diesel's own work out of archives in Germany. So, and that, it was like the geeky side of Indiana Jones, not the whip and the gun and the running boulders, but the finding of some little piece of information that for most people would mean nothing, but in the context of this story opens up enormous doors. I mean, it's just little pieces of treasure. And those moments were so fun to discover.
The letters in particular. I mean, Rudolf was so in love with his wife. It was so neat to even see, how dedicated, down to the last letter. And even though you have different interpretations of what he may have meant in it and everything, but just seeing how that stood the test of time.
Yeah, he really was such a romantic.
Yeah,
that their relationship really was a beautiful piece of the story. And he also was very forward-looking in a way that he was able to see around corners from a technology perspective.
Yes.
He was thinking about pollution and engine efficiency and energy independence. So, one of his visions for the engine was that it would run on vegetable oil or peanut oil, and that he could break up the fuel monopolies, not through a law like the Sherman Antitrust Act, but through his technology, and that most nations have farmers that can grow their own fuel. We don't need to run around fighting wars over that.
Yep. Well, one thing that I found really interesting was just tracing his whole family history, yes, and how he sort of came to be, and his wife and their connections with Germany and Britain and everything. But then how his sort of intellectual mind worked when he started digging deep into the other alternatives for all of this, and how you track the developments and, the setbacks and the successes. And through doing that, we learn all of this stuff about history in general and the evolution. I mean, it's reminded me a little bit, except it was fiction. It's not All the Light You Cannot See, because that was a novel, but there was another book around that time about the war between Edison.
Oh, was this made into a movie like the
Yes.
Power War or something like that?
Yes.
Power something or other. Yes.
Something like that. Anyway, because this sounds like so foolish to say, but we run around in our day-to-day lives and we don't take notice or even ask who the people are that we whose names we throw around all the time. And all of those names are in your book, and they become full-on people, right? Edison and, his relationship to alcohol and his wife, and, they become full-on living people, particularly the way that you write them. And so then like today's world suddenly looks a little bit different as a result.
That is one of the fun parts of the book. And I think as I do future books, I want to stay in this period, this quarter century before leading up to World War I, which I refer to jokingly as Downton Abbey, the early years, prior to the war, when the world lived differently. There are all these royal courts throughout Europe and these empires. And I'm, gone immediately after World War I, I'm sure for the better, but there is a certain romance to it. And the cast of characters is phenomenal. Like Adolphus Busch is another who,
Yep.
As the engine came out, it was the licensing model was that people would take the rights to market and manufacture the engine by national territory. So Adolphus Busch, the founder of Anheuser-Busch, had it for North America. And you learn so much about him. He was a diesel pioneer, using it initially to power pumps for water in his breweries, but also built a separate business building diesel engines for the U.S. Navy and their submarine fleet. It's just a charming period of time, that sort of Gilded Age time, and the cast of characters really is so fascinating.
It's not so different fundamentally to what's happening in technology today, or even like and I feel like this would be akin to, Elon Musk just like up and disappearing, right? At the time being such a big deal. But even, I don't know if you saw this movie about the invention of the Palm and about the BlackBerry. Did you watch this movie? Like nobody watched this movie.
No, I haven't seen that one.
It's really interesting, but it's all about the building of the BlackBerry company and the founders, and then what happens at the end when Apple, unveils the iPhone and how they didn't see it coming, and, the rise and fall of BlackBerry. But it's so interesting because we see these companies and how this repeats itself through entrepreneurial history, really, of what happens when, regulation, yes, and and of course it happens with oil and diesel and all of that too, like who gets preferential treatment and why from different governments, but then just like what you do and how do you continue to innovate and who ends up making it through. I don't know. I find it absolutely fascinating.
And there, as you say, there's a lot of that in here, and Standard Oil plays a key role. And one of the reasons Rockefeller was such a suspect and had such a motive is Standard Oil was really on the ropes in 1930, because while Rockefeller was the richest man in the world already by that time, Standard Oil had made all their money through kerosene. They were really in the illumination business and lighting, and the electric light bulb had come along and basically wiped out their prospects. Gasoline for all those decades had been a nuisance product that they would throw away. And then suddenly the combustion engine comes along that can run on gasoline, and they have a lifeline, except that diesel is potentially there to say, no, we don't need gasoline, we're going to run on vegetable oil.
Amazing. One of my favorite parts is when you're going through your final conclusion and going back through different documents, and how you said you found the Easter egg about 30 years, and you're like, maybe it's just me, but I think that's what it was. Were you just like so excited finding out all this stuff and being like, oh my gosh?
It is. So when I was of course, I was seeing Diesel everywhere. I'm like, he's just been under the surface all along, all around us. Everywhere we go, I see Diesel. And it was just yet another one of those moments. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So how you spent 5 years on it, what was the writing process like, and how different was it from your fiction writing?
It was a learning curve for me, for sure, and a very daunting one, because as you know, when you sell a novel, you pretty much write the full manuscript and you sell the finished product, or 95% finished, and maybe you do a bit with your editor. And that's what I was used to. And unless you're a big name, maybe you're on 2-3 book deal or something like that. But with nonfiction, as I learned, you don't sell a finished book, you sell a proposal. And there's a very standard look for a proposal. It's roughly a 30-page document. There might be a sample chapter, but there's a cast of characters, a discussion of the original research you're going to do, a discussion of the competitive books in the market. So I learned from my agent how a proposal for a nonfiction book looks for the first time, and worked through that, which was a very helpful process for me to think about structuring the book itself. But I've always done a lot of research for my novels as well. So the research piece, I have some background with and genuinely love doing. I miss working on this book. I would tell my wife and kids, like, okay, I'm going to go play with my imaginary friend Rudolf Diesel for a little while, and like disappear to my office for a few hours. And I would tell enough stories to the family over the dinner table that he became this kind of 3-dimensional character in our own home. So I'm feeling his absence now, although fun to get up and talk about him. But, I used to spend 8 hours a day grinding away on his story and this investigation of what happened.
Oh my gosh. So
but it's
now,
fun. One other difference too, I guess, quickly to note is that with fiction, I generally write by hand on yellow legal pads, and then I type that in. And I try to stay away from the internet. With nonfiction, I could do it anywhere. I can be on a plane or on a train or whatever. With the nonfiction writing, I have to sort of be in my spot. I have stacks of secondary research material around me. I do want to be on my laptop. I didn't write by hand at all. Everything was keyed in, and I was making little, turns to the internet to look something up quickly or whatever. So it's a different, the mechanics of the writing were different as well.
You write your novels by hand. That's wild. Wow.
Yeah.
For those listening who aren't familiar with your novels, can you just describe them all and sort of even how you got into writing to begin with? Like what happened after Idea Lab for you to become a novelist?
It's so fun to talk with you about this, our professional histories that overlapped 20 some years ago. So from Idea Lab, where you and I worked in around 99, 2000-ish, you started in LA and then came to New York.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I was in New York only, although I made that trip to Pasadena one time, which was fun. From there, I joined a startup that was about 3 people in information security, like tech. And I became president and CEO of that and ran it for about 10 years and sold it in 2011. In the last years of it, I was just so ground down and frustrated. There were some dynamics there that were very challenging. I was traveling a ton, and we had just had our second child. And my wife noticed, you're short-tempered and burnt out, and maybe we should take a look at the long-term prospects of this situation. And by that time, because I've been traveling so much, I've always loved to read. I've always loved to tinker with writing, but I never took any formal writing training or an MFA or anything like that. But I've been tinkering with this idea for a novel. And a few months later, I showed it to her, which is this very potentially awkward situation in a marriage. If you're, without the other, like, oh, so-and-so must be a writer, but boy, it's bad. But fortunately, she liked it, encouraged me to get an agent. And I was lucky to fairly quickly find one who also liked it and thought it needed a lot of work, but did that work with the agent. And then was lucky to find a deal with S&S for the first book. So that one's called Ghost of Manhattan, set on Wall Street. It's really about a marriage, but it's set on Wall Street. And the husband in the marriage is a trader, a fixed income trader for Bear Stearns, and talks about that bubble crash. The second one is called The Means, and it's really political fiction. It explores the intersection of politics and media and follows a presidential campaign. It's thriller-ish, but sort of smart politics with a twist ending. And then the third is called Trophy Son. And that's about a young tennis prodigy, and it really explores our achievement-obsessed culture, which is really not how you and I grew up. When you and I were coming home, our parents were like, "Be home by dinner, and I'll ring the bell." But now everybody's scheduled with chess and sports and all these other things, and tennis is really at the extreme end of that. So it explores a tennis prodigy going through that, and on the research side, all these were much more contemporary. So for the tennis book, I did interviews with John Isner and James Blake, who really helped out. And I always have found that a lot of research for fiction, too, helps you get it on the page in a more compelling and forceful way. So that kind of research on the Diesel side, of course, no one's really living to do a lot of primary, although I did find 2 of his descendants that I spoke with, but it was, more on the secondary research archival side.
Have you been watching the U.S. Open?
I have, and have been loving it. The Djokovic-Alcaraz story is great. Coco Gauff is amazing. What an athlete she is, and so composed. And so, pretty hot for those folks, yes. But really fun. Love watching tennis.
I went twice this year, and just watching it, I was like drenched. And I'm like, I cannot believe these players are operating on such an amazingly efficient body level in this extreme heat. It's insane. But anyway, I remember we read The Means for this book club I was in, which is how I even learned you had become an author. So funny.
Oh, funny.
A while ago. Yeah. Okay. So for your next book, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm not sure yet. And I will say, though, that I want to stay in this same period, that quarter century leading up to World War I. And it's funny, my editor and I have this joke that one writer's footnote could be another writer's whole book. You can grab that and just run. And so I think that in this case, one of my footnotes will be my own next book. So there's one story in there that is just sort of a footnote tangent right now, but I'm really fascinated by it. So it'll probably be in the same period and have a connection to Diesel.
So interesting. Wait, and tell me about your podcast.
The podcast is called Dedicated. I do it in partnership with SiriusXM and talk to top writers. And we begin each episode with the guest's favorite cocktail, which I have some bartending background. So I fix a cocktail right on set and we have a drink and sometimes 2 or 3. And by the end of the show, we're a little tipsy, but those sometimes make for the best episodes. And it's a lot of fun. Talk about the latest work, but also life and behind the scenes stuff. I mean, it's really fun. It's a chance. Some of these folks are people I've known for a long time and are good friends. Like Amor Tolles came on and he and I had a fun catch up, and other people that I'd never met before, like Jennifer Egan or someone. So it's been really fun. It's a chance for me to do a little bit more socially. I miss the Idea Lab days when we'd have a team and talk. I do embrace my alone time and I love writing, but it's fun to tap into something else once in a while too.
I love talking to authors, as we're doing right now. This is like meta conversation, talking about authors while talking to an author about talking to other authors. But no, I think it's almost like you prolong the fun experience of reading, but you like bring it into life in a sanctioned way or something that you couldn't just sit around reading all day.
No, that's true. Yeah. And it gets me reading too. To your point and passion, when I have people on, I always do read the book. Sometimes I've already, I read their books years ago, but it's up to my reading game quite a bit. I'm more at like 2 or 3 books a week, where I used to be at half a book a week, probably.
Yeah. Have you learned how to read really quickly? Do you read quickly?
I think it is like a muscle. You can get there's only so fast I can go. I'm actually not a very fast reader, but I'm probably a little faster now than I was.
Wait, and go back to this whole writing with why write by hand, and how did that start? I'm like, you're like the last person doing this, maybe 1 or 2.
I know it's like me and Nelson DeMille, I think, might be the last 2. But although, Jennifer Egan, I think, does a little bit by hand. She's sort of a hybrid. The reason for me, though, is purely because I'm a hunt and peck kind of guy. Like I type with 2 or 3 fingers per hand. So
okay.
It's like a prize fighter. Your ability per pound is good, but my word pace per finger is not bad, but I only type with about 4 or 5 fingers. And so I'm really slow and I can't keep up. And it also helps me to have it on the page where I can draw arrows and cross out. Somehow that works better for the way that I think. And then it's not totally wasted because I'll take those yellow legal pads. I usually write in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I'll type it in. And that's a chance to kind of comb the hair of it a little bit as it goes in. Interesting.
So who is exciting coming up on your podcast, or who have you talked to lately that was really interesting? Or
let's see. So season 1 wrapped and season 2 starts this month in September. Scott Turow will be one of the first. He's terrific and so fun. And I learned a lot. I didn't realize he was a practicing attorney even after presumed innocent. He's this celebrity lawyer writer. And then he'd walk into a courtroom and litigate. People are like, oh my God, I'm litigating against Scott Turow. Even the judge would be like, this is weird. Like, this is huge celebrity. I've got to sort of run this circus. Who else is coming on? Fiona Davis.
Oh, yeah, I love her. Mm-hmm.
And then last season, really just had some great folks on. David Duchovny came on, and Rick Springfield, who have both written novels and nonfiction stuff. Lee Child, who I love and is terrific. Nelson DeMille, Amor Tolles, Jess Walter, who wrote Beautiful Ruins. Anna Quinlan came on.
Love Anna.
Really, really good stuff.
That's awesome. Amazing. We should team up and do a powerhouse.
Oh, we got to, you know what? I'll do the bartending. We'll co-host. And that would be fun. We should team up.
That would be fun. That would be fun. I don't know. Wouldn't know which, maybe Aperol spritzes or something. Afternoony. Probably don't usually make those. Okay. Well, what advice do you have for aspiring authors?
The best advice I can give is, I actually got this advice from this friend years ago, and I hadn't written anything yet, but I had this idea because I had finished The Gold Coast by Nelson DeMille. And when I finished it, I thought, I want to make people feel the way this novel made me feel. I just loved that book, and it remains one of my favorites. And I had an idea for a book, and I was just sort of not getting going on it, which I think is an issue for a lot of people. And I was at this event with this guy who's a songwriter, and I was telling him about it, and he was sort of half listening, and I'm like, well, what do you think? And he goes, just start writing. And then he pounds the second half of his gin and tonic and walks off. And thought nothing of it. But for me, it was he moved on to the bar and got his another gin and tonic. But I was left standing there like, my God, I just have to start writing. And it was advice I'd probably heard 100 times before. But somehow in that moment, I heard it and it got in. And the next day I did do something about it. And I started writing an outline. And sometimes that's the easiest way to get in. It's, for me, like Lee Child does an outline, Amor Towles, obsessive outliner. He has drafts of his outline. I think outlining is a great step for me just to get started, just to get the motors, moving. And so I started the outline, which is far easier to start than the first sentence of page 1. And then from there, it didn't look back. So I think the best advice is the most simple advice, which you may or may not hear this time, but maybe you'll hear it one time, and just start writing.
Amazing. Love it. Great. Well, the last question I have is, like, now that we have this new alternate theory to history, what do we do with that? Where does it go? Like, how do you get it into the Encyclopedia Britannica? Like, how do you rewrite history at this time?
I am hoping that through your podcast and me getting the word out here, that Encyclopedia Britannica is listening and they will update their entry. But I think that my hope is this will get some coverage. I mean, the deficit of appreciation for Rudolf Diesel is massive. Mm-hmm. Of course, we know the engine. I mean, and one of the things is, to this day, it still powers the global economy. And imagine a tropical fruit growing in some region around the equator. All the farm equipment used to grow it, diesel powered. It gets loaded onto a truck. Anything larger than a passenger car, diesel powered. A crane, diesel powered, loads it onto a cargo ship. All cargo ships, diesel. Goes across the ocean, unloaded truck onto a train. 100% of trains are diesel powered. Nothing moves without diesel more than 120 years later. And so the engine is sort of firmly established as, the most important power source of the last century, and remains our most important power source. But the appreciation of the man is just completely absent. And there's actually a photo on my website that has this little plaque of his home where he was born in Paris. He had emigrated from Germany. He was born in Paris. And there's like graffiti around it. And it's just this sad little thing. And so I hope that this book will put him up there with Ford and Tesla and Edison and others where he belongs.
Amazing. Well, congratulations. And yeah, congrats. It was great.
Oh, Zibby, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks a lot. All right.
See you soon.
Okay. Bye, Doug. Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.